Hello everyone, this is Mini Ninja speaking. Welcome to what is going to be part 2 of what is going to be likely a part 3 or a 3-part video series of me attempting to customize my Dragon Star's Final Form Cooler figure to not stand out as much compared to the rest of my normal collection, which is mostly consisting of SH Figuarts figures. For those that didn't catch the last episode, which I will include in the description by the way, basically the gist of what I did on that one is I took the figure and pretty much separated as much as physically possible, or I could safely separate the figure. Gave the figure a bit of a wash, mostly to get rid of any body oil, finger markings that might affect the paint job and such. And using a little bit of a watered down or thinned out light gray paint, I took it with an airbrush in order to apply a little bit of a liberal shading from below in order to try to make a little bit of a shadow effect, and also took that same paint and tried to make a bit of a wash out of it in order to really emphasize all the different etchings and depths of the sculpt that are actually present on the figure for both the upper body as well as the head sculpt itself, which are actually almost invisible because the original figure only uses like a base white plastic. There's no real paint on the figure itself, minus maybe the gems and the actual eyes. So I'm really trying to help sell that a bit more. What we're going to be attempting to do on this particular video is attempting to disguise the joint openings themselves, which as you can see are very prominent on the shoulders, the elbows, as well as the knees, and basically use thermoplastic in order to cover them up and make it so it's a little more of a subtle blend, aka make it try to fit in a little more with my regular collection, which is mostly SH Figuarts figures. Now for the most part I should be able to layer the next bits up, which you will see me do in the next bit of the video, but for the shoulder joints in particular, I actually opt to try to shave off like a small millimeter or so off the front and back of that, just because that particular joint I feel sticks out a little more than the other ones. Now the key word is you only want to try shaving off a little bit. I'm not sure I would even recommend doing this in the future. 2020 I might have been able to skip this step, but the reason I'm only taking off a smidge, as I was about to say, is because if you dig too deep, I'm worried you'll accidentally destroy the pin which is holding the shoulder in place, and basically that destroys the joint, and I don't know a way to fix this one because of how kind of dug it is into the body in this case. So if you're going to do this step, just be very careful with how much you shave off, if you even decide to shave anything off. For the next step of this particular process, what we're going to be doing is I'm going to be using a thermoplastic that goes by the name of Thibra in order to try to make some coverings for all those joint openings. Now for those that are not familiar with what Thibra is, basically think of it like an alternative version of Warbler, which is another thermoplastic that is mostly used by the cosplay community for sort of prop making and armor building fashions. And the way these particular materials work is when you give them enough heat from like a heat source like my gun here, what happens to those materials is that they go from nice kind of a rigid plastic state and become a lot softer and malleable that allow you to kind of put in a lot of more interesting bends and curves into them. And in the case of the Thibra, I find when you heat it up quite a bit, it becomes a lot more putty-like, which means you can actually add some extra sculptural detail in well. And they actually stick well not to just other thermoplastics, but also I find plastics like the one that I'm using here for the Dragon Stars figures. Best part on that one, once they become cool, they go back to their original hard plastic state and actually tend to stick to the other plastics very well. Take very well to paint, so basically you can prime and paint them afterwards. And in case you kind of fudge up details, you can actually take the same heat gun, heat the plastic up again, and the thermoplastic will become malleable enough and you can work with it some more. It also makes it very friendly because if you have little scraps, bits and pieces here and there, you can heat that stuff up and kind of merge them back together to a certain degree, so you don't have a lot of waste for this material, I find. So which is a good way, once you buy some, it's very cost effective in a sense, because you don't have a lot of throwaway stuff. That being said, the one downside I am finding with Thibra as I've been working with it more and more is that unfortunately it doesn't seem to take the sanding particularly well. So you definitely want to be able to try to get it as close to your general shape as possible, and if you want to do some sanding or slight alterations to smooth things out, you want to use some other material in order to do that later, because when you sand this stuff, I find it tends to fray at the ends, which is not always an ideal arrangement, of course. But there are ways to get around that. And if you kind of have a lot more patience than I do, you could probably just heat it up carefully and again and just slowly smooth things over in order to kind of negate any issues that I come up with a little bit later, to be totally honest. Good, all in all, what you see me working on is the shoulder bed, trying to heat it up and smooth it out there, and for the most part, I have relatively high success, and I repeat this process for all the other joints. This is what it looks like after that part of the process, and if you overlook the fact that the gray sticks out like a sore thumb, you'll notice that it's still a smooth enough finish on the plastic itself, and also the articulation is completely uninhibited in this case. Everything is able to move exactly as much as it used to, and that's good because that means I didn't accidentally freeze a joint and have to go back and refix this stuff. Even on the shoulder joints, which, as I remind you, I had to sand down a smidge because they stuck out so much, that work at least went to a good cause because you can see everything moves as well as it should. Or at least it could before. Like I said, the shoulders on this particular toy I feel are a little bit rubbish, but as long as it's at least working as good as it used to, we're still alright on this one. The one thing I do want to adjust though is that with the way I applied it on the shoulders, the actual thermoplastic has a bit of a noticeable separation in certain parts where it came on a little thick, so I'm actually going to be using some Tamiya putty in order to try to smooth that out. Now, admittedly, I do a very terrible job of showing this on camera, which is why it's going to only be a small snippet, but what I'm basically doing is, while wearing a glove, I take a small dollop of the putty material and kind of massage it over the various openings in order to try to hide the transition a little bit better between the thermoplastic and the actual figure plastic. Now, to explain a few details about the putty that you really need to know when you're trying to use it for this purpose. One, the material does actually tend to dry up pretty quickly. What I mean by that is, as you can see, I'm applying with my fingers there. I'm having to work actually pretty fast on there because if you leave it on any surface too long, then it will actually within like a moment or so dry up enough where it's solid enough for some light contact, even though the material itself hardens after 24 hours. So you want to give it a full day's worth of time before you really want to take any sandpaper or something to smooth things out. Also, during that whole drying period, there is some shrinkage involved. So the putty is not something that is entirely stable, I find. So even if you put actually quite a generous amount, as the thing dries out, there's something about the chemical makeup where you'll notice the actual size of the material tends to shrink on whatever surface you apply it on. So while that is good because if you accidentally overdo it, then it will become a little more manageable over time. If you're trying to use it to fill in a larger gap, you might notice that you might need to go another round with it later in order to fill it in, because as it dries out, the gap becomes more noticeable because, well, the material shrinks and no longer covers it fully. So those are a few things you want to keep in mind, but at least when it does that, or if you need to apply another layer on it, once it fully dries the first time, you can safely put on enough, at least a handful of layers on top of it, and be able to still sand these things down with relative ease, which is exactly what I plan on doing on this particular figure. Our next step is a very necessary one, but not necessarily the most exciting one, and that's trying to sand the surfaces back to a more smooth finish. Now, you see me here working with, admittedly, I didn't do any wet sanding on this one, which, for those that might not know, basically you either wet the surface of the thing you're sanding, or the sandpaper, or both, in order to make it so that the dust doesn't kick up into the air as high. But what I should mention is, as I was doing this, I am wearing a dust mask in the process, and I do have an industrial fan in my working space to help really blow things out. So generally speaking, if you're doing any kind of sanding, you really should try some wet sanding. But even with that, I'd say you need to be wearing some kind of a facial protection or breathing protection, as well as preferably working in a more open space to expose yourself to less dust inhalation. While it doesn't seem like a lot at once, that stuff will begin to irritate your throat over time if you do this for long enough, so please exercise some basic safety. Just to put that out there. Our next and last particular part of this video is going to be using the skin tone purple that I mixed in last time in order to kind of hide my work up to this point. So, as you might notice, the purple itself doesn't have exactly the best coverage by any means, but that's done on purpose in this case. I actually used a bit of an airflow improver because I wanted to originally airbrush this stuff on there, and the reason I used that is because I wanted to make sure this is very thin paint for one good reason, and that's basically to make sure that I could blend this thing better. Basically, for model work or kind of any action figure work for that matter, you really want to work with thinner paints for the most part, so that especially if you're brushing the stuff on manually like I am right now, you build the things up in layers, and even if your first layer isn't exactly the most accurately done one, which I'll be frank, my painting technique is atrocious to say the least, I know for a fact that anything that is wrong with the previous layer, once it dries up, I can just take another thin layer of paint and do corrective work on top of that, and basically over a few different layers, everything will be smooth in the finish, and you won't be able to really see any kind of brush strokes on there, because they'll be blended in well enough. It is exactly what we're using to accomplish this. I think I did this overall in 3 layers over all the various joints, and this is what that process looks like at the end. One thing I do see here now that I have a better look though is that the paint job came out a little glossier than I planned, so basically a little more shine than the base plastic. But considering the next step also involves attaching kind of or spraying a matte finish on top of everything, that's going to be rectified fairly fast, so it's not a deal breaker by any means. That's going to be a quick fix. And on that note, we're pretty much wrapped up on this video, but just to kind of explain what's going to be on the part of the third and final step of this one, is we're going to be doing some last minute paint cleanup and maybe a little added shading for the purple parts, just to help sell the muscle tone a little bit more, clean up the white paint a little more, and get some extra details of etching, the matte finish, and reassembly. And I plan on doing that video very soon while the weather's still letting up, so yeah, we'll definitely be talking a little more soon on this one, and I hope to show you all the finished piece sooner rather than later. For now though, take care.